In the previous video of this series, we took a look at how deadly every final smash would be if we brought them into the real world. But that's not the only way to die a horrific death via Smash Bros. So, today let's dive into the world of the Assist Trophy, looking at every trophy featured in Ultimate. In my last video, I got in trouble in the comments section for not including enough lore and having some inconsistencies in my ranking system. I'm sure there will be plenty more to debate for this one too, but I'll set some ground rules to hopefully create a more consistent ranking this time around. I'll include the lore of an assist trophy as long as it enhances the real-world analysis, but I'll avoid any supernatural or impossible elements. For example, if this dancing spoon was an assist trophy, I'd include whether it's canonically a metal spoon or a plastic spoon. But if the canon says the spoon is bestowed with magic powers that make it the most powerful being in the universe, that will be disregarded. That said, I'm putting this spoon in last place, and let's dive into the rankings proper. Number 59. Nintendog. I can't confirm for sure this was the first ever assist trophy shown off for a Smash game, but it's certainly the first one I remember seeing, way back from the E3 launch trailer for Brawl. A mainstay of the series, the Nintendog has appeared across each entry since, and while the breed of dog has changed, the cuteness has not. As we're focusing only on Ultimate's assist trophies, the dog here is a toy poodle. Not only is this ranked among the 20 least aggressive breeds by Service Dog Training School International, and is clearly nothing but curious and cuddly here, but it's also a hypoallergenic breed that doesn't shed much, so even people with allergies would have less to worry about. Although there is no fully hypoallergenic breed, so severe allergies could still act up. This assist is good vibes only, and rightfully takes its crown for an obvious last place. Number 58. Squid Sisters. I'd argue not only would this be generally harmless in real life, it would actually be kind of fun. The Squid Sisters, who later play a more significant role in the Splatoon story, here reprise their original roles as a pop duo. Live music is big business, currently raking in almost $12 billion annually. As the primary way that most musicians earn, this cost can reflect back on ticket prices. Many concerts have had tickets average several $100s, but likely the most expensive concert ticket ever was a pair of seats for the 2007 Led Zeppelin reunion that sold at auction for $168,000. There's no indication you have to pay for the Squid Sisters' appearance though, so I don't think you're looking at financial issues here. Is there any possible way this could be harmful? In-game, the effect of the Squid Sisters has the camera zoom in, shrinking the stage's blast zones. Of course, we don't walk around with blast zones in real life, so I don't see this as any different than attending a concert in a small room like a classic basement show. I suppose at a stretch, it could be like attending a concert in a shrinking room, but it never gets that small. Loud music in a smaller space does pose a risk of hearing loss with repeated exposure though. Surprisingly little sound can cause long-term impact to hearing with repeat exposure. What makes this hearing loss especially difficult to account for is that it generally occurs painlessly and gradually, but studies show that sounds as low as 85 decibels, equivalent to a window AC unit, can begin to deteriorate hearing after 8 hours of exposure. Pop concerts can naturally range in volume, but fall at an average of 95 decibels, which can begin to damage hearing around 47 minutes in. This actually does pose real-world concern for concert goers, but as the Squid Sisters' performance only lasts around 15 seconds, even on a loud sound system, you should feel free to kick back and enjoy. Maybe the most irritating outcome would be succumbing to intrusive musical imagery, more colloquially known as the earworm. Commonly associated with OCD symptoms, but also affecting the general public at large, 85% of us will experience the unbelievable irritation of mentally repeating 15 to 30 second chunks of a catchy tune on loop. That said, I'm still giving this one the second to last spot because not only is it not deadly at all, but it might even be a bit fun. If the worst outcome of this is a few hours of frustrated humming, there's much, much worse yet to come. Number 57. Nightmare. Even though Nightmare is a menacing presence in his home games, he doesn't make use of any of his attacks here. Instead, he sticks to his general theme of spreading nightmares by imposing darkness across the stage. This one you can even try for yourself. You'll be fine. Number 56. Yuri Kazuka. The condensed backstory of the character in her home series of Fatal Frame is that Yuri develops a sixth sense after surviving a car accident, a sense that allows her to see ghosts. In her home game, she takes photos of the spirits with her camera obscura, which is what we see in her assist trophy appearance. Despite the scary color filter, quite literally all she's doing is taking your picture. To clarify the device she's using, a camera obscura in its simplest form is a small box with a pinhole to allow light in. This pinhole allows light in to project a flipped image on the opposite end of the box. Possibly this sounds familiar, as it's a common grade school class project to make a camera obscura. This simple optical device was a forerunner to modern cameras, and even though Yuri's camera is quite a bit fancier than a box with a pinhole in it, it doesn't change the principle of the move. The worst outcome here is that Yuri gives you a shoddy picture you have to pretend to like until you have time to throw it out. Number 55. Vince. Vince will paint a variety of images that cover players and deal a steady damage. The things he paints though really have no bearing. In-game they don't come to life or have any special effects beyond being paintings. So I don't see this as any different than Vince hanging a wet canvas over you. Unless you have a severe allergy to paint chemicals, I don't see this as any worse than mildly inconvenient. Number 56. Devil. This one I struggled a lot on placement because it's difficult to figure out exactly what this would translate to. Pulled from the game Devil World, the character is obviously a rendition of the classic fallen angel from Religions Abound, except this odd briefs-wearing demon doesn't do any of the classic devil things. No fire and brimstone, no eternal damnation, no. Instead, he changes the blast zones on stage. This closely parallels his function in his home game, where his pointing shifts the maze walls over and limits the playable area. Maybe you'll have a different interpretation, but I don't see this as any different from the character slowly moving the walls around near you. Of course, the primary danger of moving walls would be getting caught between walls and being crushed. But this move doesn't really operate like a trash compactor, instead it would just push whatever room you were in over. I suppose if you were on a cliff or something and the ground around you was moved over, then you might suffer a deadly fall, similar to falling offstage in-game after the blast zones are shifted. But I think this move would almost certainly just be irritating instead of harmful. Let me know if you think there's a better way to interpret this to the real world. Number 53. Flies and Hand. Another one you can test for yourself. Yeah. You'll be fine, unless you're a fly. Number 52, Color TV Game 15. Color TV Game 15, and don't you dare call it Pong, was a little tough to place. This game is based off the second home console ever created by Nintendo, and definitely not inspired at all by Pong. Where did you even get that idea? And there's not a lot of lore behind it. So, let's go the classic literal route. The base game is inspired by Ping Pong, although in Smash it obviously is a scaled up version of the game. The primary hazard of the move is the ball itself, which on character scale puts it around 1.5 feet. I tried to see if there were any giant ping pong balls for purchase around that size for a sense of weight, but this doesn't seem to be a thing that real people have been interested in buying. We can guess though that ping pong balls would be essentially totally harmless, and probably pretty fun to throw at friends. Ping pong balls are almost entirely air, but even the plastic shell is made from a lightweight and bouncy plastic called ABS. This is a recent shift though, so a ball from the 70s when Color TV Game 15 was released would probably be celluloid, which was standard until 2014 when it was dropped as a material because of its flammability. As a side note, even though the materials operate similarly, there are slight differences in how the materials behave, which led to a scholarly article published in the Journal of Human Kinetics, comparing the effect of changing table tennis ball material from celluloid to plastic on the post-collision ball trajectory. At one point the study literally uses this equation. Like, huh? I will always appreciate so much when incredibly complicated science is put toward extremely trivial discoveries. Anyway, all this to say that it would be like getting bonked with a rubber bouncy ball, if not even less noticeable. Number 51. Starfy. Although officially neither a starfish nor an actual star, there is no canonical explanation of what this creature actually is. The legendary Starfy, a DS game that was actually the first Starfy game localized to the US, refers to him as a starfish though, and that's canon enough for me. In-game, Starfy will attack by spinning, which isn't something you'd really contend with. Starfish kind of crawl along using tiny tube feet on the underside of their bodies, and they move incredibly slowly, around 10 yards an hour. But if you wanted to make a starfish rotate quickly, you could throw it. It would be very unpleasant to get hit with the crown of thorns starfish, but this prickly guy is an outlier, as most starfish have significantly less prominent spines. Most closely resembling Starfy is this almost cute thing called the cushion sea star. Although sources differ, some say they can grow to around 1.5 feet and weigh around 8 pounds. At least according to this one you can buy. If one is spun into you, it probably wouldn't hurt much as they seem to be quite squishy, but it would definitely be unpleasant. Why? Well, a good hint is the cushion sea star's other name, the slime star. When threatened, it will produce an almost laughable amount of slime in defense, so much that it has to be kept separate in an aquarium so its slime won't impact other animals. Very embarrassing, Starfy. This move would be gross, sloppy, and probably a little funny, but the harm would be almost entirely received by Starfy. Number 50. Dylan. Pulled from the obscure tower defense / action hybrid Dylan's Rolling Western, the move used in Smash would be the most harmless of any Dylan move they could have chosen. In his home series, Dylan has several move options to attack, including slashing with his claws. Although not especially dangerous by themselves, probably only leaving relatively minor scratches, the main concern is that armadillos are known carriers of serious diseases like rabies and leprosy. Even a shallow cut would lead to a devastating infection. But thankfully, Dylan ignores his secret bio-weapon and instead decides to roll at you as a sort of bargain bin Sonic the Hedgehog. This rolling defense is actually somewhat of a misconception. Of the 20 species of armadillo, only 2 can actually roll into a ball, as most have armor plates too inflexible to curl much. The idea that an armadillo is going to do any damage to you via rolling is pretty far-fetched. Generally, armadillos are pretty adorably pathetic in their defense mechanisms. Armadillos will usually freeze to see if they'll be ignored before scurrying off as quick as possible to find a burrow. Another truly silly defense that's surprisingly common in the armadillo world will have them jumping as high as possible when threatened, up to 4 feet straight vertical, to intimidate predators. This dopey defense is why armadillos are such common roadkill. When frightened by an oncoming car, they will often jump straight into it instead of passing safely underneath. Even the couple species that can twist themselves up into a sphere don't roll around like an armored wheel, but rather they will stay still while curled up in the hope a predator will lose interest and move on. The idea of an armadillo rolling around, especially at any meaningful speed, just isn't something Dylan would be able to achieve. Even if someone tried to bowl Dylan at you with friction and its slightly oblong shape, I think it would lose speed quickly. At worst, Dylan might lightly bump you while curling up, but the only damage here is the emotional damage being experienced by this terrified nubbin of a creature. Number 49. Ghosts. This one is tough. 1 in 5 Americans say they've encountered a ghost, but despite centuries of search, there is no hard scientific evidence to back up the spirit world as of now. This is annoying for several reasons. Firstly, it validates the crushing existential dread that comes from having no tangible proof of life after death, thus implying that we are no more than a limited spasm of consciousness wrought by accidental chance biology, devoid of soul or meaning or purpose, and secondly, and more importantly, it means I don't know how to rank them. The ghosts are clearly tangible to some degree. In their home game, they barely function like ghosts at all. They can fully damage the player and have no ability to phase through walls. I considered cheating a little and going to the source, the fact that ghosts weren't originally even considered ghosts. There is a superbly in-depth article on the Atari Compendium about how every version, sequel, and port of Pac-Man before the 1982 Atari VCS 2600 referred to them as monsters, going back to the original Japanese Puckman. The article backs up the claim with a list of every pre-VCS guidebook that labels them as monsters, as well as a slew of arcade flyers for early games that do so as well. It even links a clip from an early 80s episode of Taxi, where a character describes them as monsters instead of ghosts.
You see those monsters in the middle?
Depending on what type of monster we're thinking here, it might be easier to find a real-world equivalent, but after much deliberation, I decided it felt like too much of a cheat. They are clearly referred to as ghosts in Smash, and ultimately this doesn't handicap their ability to interact too much. Much of ghost lore features ghosts that can interact with tangible objects, but if we're throwing out the early game manuals referring to them as monsters, I think we also need to disregard that early manuals variably describe the ghosts as biting or eating the player alive. The ghost design bard for Smash, at least, shows no evidence during their attack that they even have mouths. Maybe you could argue we don't see the mouths in classic Pac-Man until a power pellet turns them into their frightened blue versions, but even even if they have mouths, they certainly aren't using them to attack players in Smash, let alone swallow anyone whole. All they do in-game is wander around and bump into players, so in life, I don't think this would be any worse than someone wearing a bedsheet rushing into you. Depending on speed, I think you'd escape with anywhere from light irritation to a mild bruise. Number 48. Arcade Bunny. Following their function in the 3DS application, where Arcade Bunny allows you to earn badges to decorate the system's home screen, the Arcade Bunny here uses a classic claw game to try and drag players beyond the blast zone. There is no cannon height for this claw game. In the source material, I'm assuming it's relatively consistent with an actual claw game, but clearly in Smash, it's large enough to grab players. This means it's far bigger than the largest verified real-world claw machine, which is the Santa Claw, measuring in at 17 by 8 by 12 feet. Big for a claw game, but not nearly big enough to pick up a person. But I see no reason that a larger claw couldn't be built. I was reminded here of the most traumatic film of my childhood, The Brave Little Toaster, where large magnetic claws are used in the climactic junkyard scene. Looking it up, it seems mechanical claw machines are a feature in actual junkyards. This one seems a more appropriate scale to be up against. But I'm going to assume a key caveat here, which is the Arcade Bunny is using an arcade-style claw machine, not an industrial engineering machine. And arcades are purposefully designed to challenge and largely cheat the player, as anyone who's wasted a wallet's worth of spare change trying to win a low-quality plushie will know. While the more expensive claw machines may operate on a play-till-you-win format, usually the cheaper the game and better the prize, the more the machine will be rigged against you. Even though we may have our friends stationed around the machine trying to strategically plan out an attack for securing a precariously placed stuffy, odds are that your strategy has little to do with actually picking anything up. Claw games are usually programmed to allow wins anywhere from 1 in 15 plays to 1 in 50, depending on the machine. If you've played before, you'll remember the pathetically weak claw wouldn't pick up the toy no matter how perfect the placement, which is intentional, of course. Although it varies by machine, many have claws on variable settings, for example only being strong enough to pick up a prize, say 1 in 10 times. Even in-game, the claw in Smash is easy to escape, with a proper button mash almost always securing your freedom. The only real risk of injury here would be escaping from the claw too late and falling from height, but considering the purposeful weakness of these games, you're more likely than not to escape before you're in any real danger. Number 47. Burrowing Snagret. According to the Pikmin wiki, the burrowing snagret measured somewhere in the ballpark of a foot. The animal is a cross between a bird and a snake, but given the burrowing quality, we only really need to worry about the bird end. While the Japanese and Korean names translate to snake crow, and the Spanish is elusive sparrowhawk, the bird head doesn't really resemble either a crow or a sparrowhawk. Russian swoops in with a much more apt comparison, with the Russian name translating to burrowing heron. Though also not a one-to-one, this is much closer visually to the snagret, and is just about viable size-wise. Although most herons are too large, in the multi-foot range and stretching up to 5 feet for the Goliath heron. The smallest heron, the least bittern, clocks in at around a foot. So, what kind of damage could a pecking bittern do? Honestly, not much. The beaks are pointy, but the bird is so small and light that the peck wouldn't cause much damage. Likely it wouldn't break skin, and at worst might give the equivalent of a small paper cut. Number 46. Sable Prince. The prince will attack in snake or frog form, one of which seems clearly more dangerous at first glance. That isn't to say there aren't deadly frogs though. The poison of the golden poison dart frog is potent enough to kill up to 10 people. And the reverse of that is that there are plenty of harmless snakes. Only around 15% of snake species are venomous. Obviously neither of these silly cartoon animals closely resemble their real-life counterparts, but here's my best attempt to find equivalents in nature, starting with the snake. I think the best equivalent for snake form is the blue racer. It's about right in coloration and size. Thankfully, it's not one of the 15%, and this non-venomous species isn't lethal to humans, although its bite can be rather painful. As a frog, the prince looks most visually like an Australian green tree frog, although in scale is closer to the world's largest frog, the Goliath frog. Luckily, neither frog is poisonous and have extremely weak bites, so they pose no threat other than being a bit slimy. With a roll of the dice, the Sable Prince happens to transform into some pretty harmless species, and you wouldn't come away with anything worse than a painful yet non-lethal snakebite. Number 45. Knuckles. Though sadly never promoted to a proper fighter, Knuckles does display several moves as an assist trophy that harken back to his decades in the Sonic universe. He'll use a combination of punches, dig under you followed by an uppercut, and his homing attack. As with many of the characters in the Sonic universe, we know what species Knuckles is, or at least what species Sega claims him to be. Actual echidnas look about as much like Knuckles as Sonic looks like a hedgehog, but they say echidna and I will be taking that as gospel. In many ways, the actual animal is even stranger than the character. Echidnas are covered in spines that are actually modified hairs, have no teeth but instead mash their food with their big long tongues, are one of only 2 egg-laying mammal species, host the lowest body temperature of any mammal, and also play host to the largest species of flea. Oh, and they also have a 4-headed wiener. So that's your demonetization fact of the day. Thankfully, very few of these facts are in play during Knuckles' attacks. Perhaps most realistic is the digging move. Echidnas do legitimately burrow when threatened, although not especially deep, usually leaving their buns out while sheltering. I couldn't find a clear answer on whether echidnas can jump or not, but it's certainly not leaving its burrow at any sort of threatening uppercut speed. It should also go without saying that an echidna cannot punch. This leaves only the homing attack, which is the only move that would be even marginally painful. Echidnas do curl into a ball when threatened and will flare their spines out for protection, and if an echidna hit you at speed in this curled state, it would hurt. These spines are not the sharpest in the animal kingdom. As mentioned before, they are just modified hair, so while definitely prickly, they aren't barbed or anything. Even so, this one wildlife explorer who picked up an echidna for some reason certainly didn't enjoy the experience, and the spines did cause minor skin breaks. A secondary concern is that echidnas can get decently heavy, topping out around 20 pounds. So if a curled echidna hit you at force, it would be comparable to a spiny bowling ball being chucked at you. You're looking at certain cuts and abrasions, with an embarrassing and inexplicable concussion in a worst case scenario. Not fun, but definitely survivable. If you're upset that he's not ranked higher up, take it up with Sega for picking such a nubbin of an animal. Who knows where Knuckles the Goliath tigerfish would have ranked. Number 44. Ricky. Ricky brings rough approximations of 6 of his Xenoblade Chronicles moves. Obviously least concerning is "you can do it," which heals those nearby. Although there are few miracle cures in nature, a number of drugs can provide fast-acting pain relief. While some of these drugs can lead to dependency and other issues, here I see this move as only a pain-free positive. The next move is pretty neutral. Yoink pulls items closer to Ricky, possibly using suction or in some cases maybe a magnet. This would be largely unconcerning, although it is worth being vigilant of larger items in motion, as you wouldn't want to get clocked by debris. Ricky also uses Happy Happy, which immediately raises the launch and attack powers of players. This is another move I can only see realistically being enacted via some sort of drug enhancement. Easily the most famous performance-enhancing drug is anabolic steroids. Of course, these results aren't instantaneous and are assisted by exercise, but the reason people take this drug is because it is indeed alarmingly effective. A 10-week study found a group of sedentary men on steroids gained 230% more muscle than a group that regularly lifted weights but had been given a placebo. Naturally, the group with both the steroids and workout routines gained the most muscle, but even unprompted, steroids would increase your strength just like Ricky does, just over a longer time span. Before getting carried away, here's the downside. They also come with a whole host of troubling side effects, ranging from irritating, severe acne, to life-threatening, liver tumors, heart conditions, and negative impacts to cholesterol levels. So this move could potentially have downsides if this is how we interpret it. Another drug-related Ricky attack would be Bedtime, where Ricky puts players to sleep. I mentioned this in the Final Smash video, but essentially sleeping gas is a real thing and is not without risk, although largely it'll do what it says on the tin and just temporarily knock you out. Roly-Poly is another move you probably wouldn't suffer much from. Essentially, Ricky trips players. Everybody trips, and most of the time, it isn't deadly. The last move has a few ways you could look at it. Ricky will momentarily freeze players. While there isn't exactly a way to achieve instantly being crystallized into a block of ice, you can actually get sort of close. If you ever went to a science museum as a kid, you probably have the vivid core memory of your local science instructor submerging a hot dog or a balloon in liquid nitrogen before smashing the now frozen object on the ground. Nitrogen exists all around us, but at normal temperatures only as a gas. To turn liquid, nitrogen must be cooled to just under -320 degrees Fahrenheit. So, might Ricky be hosing you with supercooled nitrogen, making you freeze and shatter like a not-so-hot dog? not so fast because of the Leidenfrost effect. Essentially, what's happening here is the temperature difference between the supercooled liquid and a room temperature body is so extreme that nitrogen instantly boils, creating a small gaseous layer that essentially acts as a thermal barrier between you and the deadly cold liquid. You can actually test this effect for yourself in reverse. If you have a very hot pan or hot plate and spray it with room temperature water, the instant vaporization of the liquid water creates this same thermal barrier, making the water almost appear to bounce across the hot surface unaffected. The protection afforded to you by the Leidenfrost effect is brief though, and if the liquid nitrogen pooled against your skin even briefly, for example getting trapped in clothing, this could cause cold burns and frostbite. This type of tissue damage would be extremely painful, and depending on severity, could be permanent. The most severe cases of frostbite are caused by prolonged exposure to extreme cold though, so especially if you kept moving as you were sprayed, the science armor provided by Leidenfrost would actually protect you from most of the damage, and you'd possibly only sustain mild frostbite called frostnip in some areas, which will hurt but eventually heal. Altogether, this makes Ricky much less dangerous than I would have expected. Number 43. Captain. The relative size of Captain and his bus would make an important distinction to how damaging it would be to get hit by. As far as I can tell, Captain doesn't have a canonical height, and we aren't helped much by looking at his species, as the Kappa is a mythological creature. He is sometimes referred to as a turtle, but even so that could give us a fair range of sizes, so I'm going to go off the vehicle itself. Even though it's referred to in-game as bus, it's really more of a sprinter van than anything. At most, there are only 3 rows of seats on board, so a sprinter is a fair ballpark comparison. This is a decently hefty vehicle, clocking around 6,000 pounds with a top speed approaching 90 miles per hour. But for a sprinter, it really doesn't do much sprinting. The vehicle in real life has a pretty slow ramp-up speed, and that's realistically reflected here, as relative to character sizes, the vehicle is only moving ballpark at 15 miles per hour. Getting hit by a vehicle this slow moving is relatively non-lethal. Studies showing pedestrians struck by cars at this speed only have a 1.8% chance of fatality, and only an 8% chance of sustaining significant injury. These numbers would be boosted a percent or two because of the vehicle's size, but even so, you have great odds of walking away fine. I will note that in this move it's less about getting hit by the vehicle and more about you getting trapped in the back and dragged off screen. There's less research on jumping from moving vehicles, but it does largely seem to be comparably dangerous to the rate of injury you'd expect from getting hit by the car. So you might be looking at light injuries from escaping at 15 miles per hour depending on how you land, but I still think this one is almost certainly survivable. Number 42. Guile. Guile makes a sort of meta use of a Street Fighter tactic called downbacking, a technique that can ready both flash kick and sonic boom inputs, allowing a player to use whichever is needed. This makes these his 2 primary attacks as an assist trophy. Flash kick is essentially a backflip where a kick is performed throughout, similar to a bicycle kick in soccer. We can get a sense of what this would do, because it's happened. For example, during this soccer match, a player went for a bicycle kick but instead kicked an opponent squarely in the face. Although certainly unpleasant, the incident didn't result in anything worse than a yellow card and some temporary, non-serious medical attention to the player on the receiving end. So let's turn our attention to the more abstract sonic boom. This move shows Guile waving his arms to unleash a crescent-shaped energy projectile. Taking the move at its literal face value, the most obvious interpretation is Guile moves his arms fast enough to break the sound barrier, which is what creates a sonic boom. This isn't even remotely possible for even the most proficient fighter. The fastest verified punch clocked in at just 45 miles per hour, over 17 times slower than the speed of sound. But we can actually substitute in a real-world example. One of the simplest objects to break the sound barrier is the bullwhip. I went over exactly why this happens in the Final Smash video, so I won't rehash that here, but essentially, the whip crack sound is a miniature sonic boom. Discussing safety concerns of using a bullwhip, the Toronto Bullwhip Club does mention the often overlooked danger of repeat exposure to whip cracks near the ear. The loud and sudden sounds can cause slow hearing degeneration over time, and they recommend earplugs for those interested in taking up the hobby. For the couple of sonic booms delivered by Guile though, especially as this is his distance attack so you wouldn't be too close to the sound, you'd probably suffer little to no lasting damage. So when he's through with his combo, I think you'd likely come out with a bloody nose and some light ear ringing at worst. Number 41. Sukapon. Oh god, what the hell is this thing? Sukapon is a bit hard to quantify because his source material is so non-specific on what he's supposed to be. Despite looking like a mass of floating pre-chewed bubblegum, Sukapon is described in his home series as a, quote, comedian robot. And even though there's no canon description of what he's made from, I'd interpret it as some type of metal or polymer. I'm going metal, as the various floating bits might be due to some type of magnetic interaction. Disregarding the mechanics of how this wacky robot would function, his moveset involves tossing various parts of himself at you or rolling into you. Although the force of impact would vary greatly depending on his composition, I think it would be reasonable to assume that each section weighs as much as a bowling ball, maybe double that for the head. Certainly his head toss move could cause some damage. If it made direct contact with an unyielding part of the body, you could be looking at fractures or even full bone breaks. Although the toss is actually pretty slow, which would give you a good amount of reaction time to deflect, and might mean you're looking at a relatively gentle underhand style incoming hit. His other favorite trick is to cartwheel into you. This one might also hurt, as he does seem to be moving pretty quickly, but most of Sukapon is dead space, so I can't imagine he'd weigh more than 70 pounds. This might hurt, but you can kind of imagine what it would be like for a 70-pound person to cartwheel into you, and I don't think you're looking at any lasting damage. Number 40. Hammer Bros. It's a bit difficult to get info on throwing hammers without accidentally getting info on hammer throwing. That said, I personally wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of either. The Hammer Bros toss a bunch of hammers at you in a high arc, and while the design in the Mario universe is somewhat unique to the games, they are similar enough to the standard claw hammer that we can use that as a reference point. Of course, hammers come in all shapes and sizes, but the most popular type of standard claw hammer only weighs in at a pound. Hammer Bros doesn't have a consistent canonical height, but a user on a Mario message board made a pretty comprehensive height chart of Mario characters that pins Hammer Bros around 4.5 feet, which seems reasonable. In Smash, these hammers are thrown around 3 times the height of Hammer Bros, clocking around 13.5 feet. So by the time it arcs back to you, it would be moving roughly 15 to 20 miles per hour depending on the horizontal force that Hammer Bros exerts. This would definitely hurt, especially if you were unlucky enough to be on the claw end of the hammer, but you have a lot of benefits here. Much of the throw's force is going into vertical movement, creating a high and slow arc which takes a lot of the deadly power a full-on throw might deal. It would also give you a reasonable amount of time to dodge or at least throw up hands to do away with the worst of the contact. Because hammers are obviously more weighted towards the head than the handle, you would be more likely to get hit by the heavy end of the hammer if it did connect, meaning an especially unlikely smack could cause a skull fracture, although death or severe lasting injury seems unlikely, especially given how easy to dodge the high slow arcs would be and the relatively low speeds of the projectile. I think you'd probably escape with bruises or minor fractures if there were a couple you didn't move in time for, although an unlucky direct hit might cause more severe damage. Number 39. Waluigi. Oh, it's the bridesmaid, never the bride. Despite being a fan favorite for upgrade to full character status, Waluigi has remained an assist trophy thus far. Here he rushes forward and stomps opponents repeatedly. In-game, this burrows them into the ground, but a gangly real-life Waluigi wouldn't have the power to do any such thing. He seems to be wearing some sort of dress shoe, which can be steel-toed, so at worst he would repeatedly stomp on your feet and cause some fractures. If your damaged feet caused you to fall, he might even get a few stomps in elsewhere. He's not done with you yet though. He'll either finish things off with a kick, which could do similar damage, or a smack of his tennis racket. Harkening back to his first ever appearance in Mario Tennis, this is a nice nod that would be quite unpleasant to be on the receiving end of. Despite angry tennis players making rackets seem like they're made of paper mache, tennis rackets are sturdy and designed to take repeated high-force hits. The pain you would experience depends largely on how Waluigi hits you. Racket strings are usually made of polyester or nylon, and although a good smack would still hurt, these materials are designed to be flexible and some of the impact would be absorbed. If Waluigi flipped their racket though and attacked you with the outer edge, it would certainly hurt much more. Most rackets are constructed with graphite, sometimes mixed with other materials, and they can withstand a lot of force. A good hit would certainly bruise and could possibly lead to an additional fracture to join your damaged feet. Waluigi, though, would be left with a racket still in fine condition to keep on playing, which is probably good as he has a lot of time on his hands, seeing as how he wasn't invited to be a main character or anything. Number 38. Jeff. What made this one slightly confusing to research is my impression of bottle rockets was as the classic grade school science experiment of the water bottle rocket, where air pressure is pumped into a bottle until eventually the pressure becomes strong enough to dislodge the bottle's cork and force the bottle skywards. This type of rocket involves no chemical reactions though and is purely driven by pressure, which wouldn't create the flames we see in Jeff's attack. What I discovered though is bottle rocket also doubles as the name given to a type of small firework, and it's slightly insane that these are legal anywhere. Here in the US, only Massachusetts outright bans consumer fireworks, and only a couple other states have much regulation at all, meaning most of the country has open access to these terrifying death traps. Bottle rockets have essentially no meaningful design put into them. They are simply a cylindrical case filled with combustible material. Considering they're basically a light explosive with a largely unpredictable trajectory, it's amazing more amateur firework enthusiasts aren't harmed every year, but reports from the American Academy of Ophthalmology indicate that annually almost 2,000 permanent eye injuries are caused by fireworks. This makes up a good fraction of the over 10,000 injuries caused by fireworks every year, with the leading injury naturally being burns. In 2022, the most recent data I could find, this tragically even included 11 deaths from firework over the year. I say over the year, but it's almost entirely 4th of July related, with 73% of injuries occurring in the weeks leading up to the holiday. Honestly, it's a bit bonkers that we just accept our 4th of July celebrations as normal, like giving 2,000-degree sparkler rods to children and telling them to run around, which incidentally causes 600 serious injuries per year, meaning you're almost 10 times more likely to end up in the hospital from a sparkler than a shark, although 100% less likely to end up the subject of a Spielberg film. Tangents aside, having a bottle rocket fired at you certainly has the potential for burns and other more serious eye injuries, as well as a non-zero chance of death if you're real unlucky. Number 37. Knuckle Joe. I got in deep trouble with the comment section for not incorporating canonical height in the last video, so if you were hoping Knuckle Joe would be in a higher spot, I'm afraid to say the canon police forbid it. Comparable in height to Kirby, Knuckle Joe is only around 8 inches tall. This isn't to say small creatures can't pack a punch. One of nature's most incredible concoctions is the pistol shrimp, which can snap its claw as fast as a bullet and create an imploding cavitation bubble to stun prey. Similar is the punch of the mantis shrimp, another one of nature's tiny formidable boxers, which is powerful enough to slice a human finger to the bone. But Knuckle Joe just doesn't seem to be doing anything like that. He's punching, and fast, but still slow enough to largely perceive what he's doing. And with just 8 inches of muscle mass, those mini punches may range from irritating to painful, but certainly not debilitating. He does have a couple of other tricks up his sleeve though. While mostly attacking with a Vulcan jab, he will use one of 2 moves as a finisher. The smash punch seems to incorporate some kind of explosion, and the rising break seems charged with electricity. Although there's no clear answer to the source of either, they would certainly amp up the deadly factor behind these punches. Even small explosions or electrical sparks can be significantly damaging at close range. Although there's no clear metric to gauge the intensity of these attacks, off of scale alone it would perhaps be similar to directly contacting a firework or sparkler, and could possibly lead to burns and other disfigurements like the surprise removal of fingers. Even though his punches are closer to tickles than TKO, the extra elements that join for the finisher are enough to make this one very unpleasant. Number 36. Akira. Representing the Virtua Fighter series, considered the first 3D fighting game, Akira is clearly an accomplished fighter, although he is outshined on multiple occasions. In his home series, he has attended the World Fighting Tournament several times, and his results have been mixed, only securing 1 win in his 2nd year. Undoubtedly though, that's more World Tournament wins than most of us will have had. Unless Jim Miller is watching, who currently holds the record for most wins in UFC history, in which case, please, God, let Jim Miller approve of my rankings because that is a very strong and very frightening lad. As evidenced by my fear of Jim Miller, a world champion fighter coming after you would certainly be risky, although statistically, not as risky as you might expect. The UFC has 578 contracted fighters and has presided over 7,500 matches. Of these, nobody has died in a cage during a fight. There are 7 fighters though who have died from fighting in sanctioned MMA fights and at least 9 more from unsanctioned events. Obviously the death toll from sporting events should be 0, but considering the unrestrained barbaric nature of UFC fights, the results are still surprising. Akira will hunt you down with a variety of jabs, including his signature move, Tetsuzanko. Even though you are statistically unlikely to die, I think you can expect some pretty unpleasant injuries, perhaps broken ribs or at the very least severe bruising. Number 35. Crystal. Using the staff she wields from her first Star Fox appearance, in Star Fox Adventures, Crystal attacks you with a variety of swipes. On contact with her staff alone, which is functionally shaped as a spear, you could certainly receive some severe injury. She does use it bizarrely though, swiping at you as if using a sword or other bladed weapon. Spears are obviously designed to be thrust head-on. While the sides are certainly sharp, it is the tip of the spear that is intended to be most effective, and slashing with the weapon is rather an odd choice of technique, as that means mostly you'll be on the receiving end of handle instead of the actually pointy bit. If you were to make it through relatively unscathed due to Crystal's odd technique, you'd once again have to deal with being frozen when she blasts you with her ice magic. I stand by my earlier comments on freezing though, and I think your handy science shield would fend off the worst of the frostbite. The fact that she's attacking with a blade though, even if she's using it weird, does seem more likely to cause severe damage than fighters who only use their fists. So I'm placing Crystal slightly above our brawlers. Number 34. Metroid. There's no direct one-to-one comparison for a Metroid, portrayed in its larval form here, but we can get close. Obviously it most closely visually resembles a jellyfish, but that doesn't really capture the function of the creature. The Metroid is a parasitic species, and in Smash, will latch onto players and drain health via its enormous teeth. A more analogous real-world creature is the sea lamprey, and from this point onwards, consider the horrifying-looking animal warning in full effect. Although more eel-like in shape, sometimes even inaccurately called lamprey eels, the part of the lamprey that is especially relevant is its Lovecraftian mouth. These parasitic fish will latch to prey and drain body fluids via a file-like tongue, using an anticoagulant in their saliva to ensure the host's blood doesn't clot and end their meal early. In their native Atlantic Ocean, lampreys act like a typical parasite and won't often kill their host, as they have here co-evolved alongside their host fish. Canals developed around the late 1800s, though, allowed lampreys access to the Great Lakes, where there is no such co-evolution, and here lampreys are a significant predator, with each individual killing up to 40 pounds of fish a year. Lampreys will sometimes attach to humans, but generally people are not especially delectable for the fish. Bites may be painful, but won't be fatal, although untreated wounds could lead to infection. Here's the thing though, Metroids aren't lamprey. They are quite a bit bigger, and there's no reason to expect if they existed in real life that they would have an aversion to latching on to people. In Smash, the Metroid only attaches itself for a few seconds, so it wouldn't have much time to feed on you, but breaking the seal to rip it off may be quite dangerous in itself. The anticoagulants that parasites use can lead to extended bleeding. For example, even after a leech has fallen off, which will only take in the ballpark of 20 minutes, the wound may continue to bleed for 10 hours on average, and can last up to a week, which can be a pretty severe medical worry. Whether leeches or lampreys, these real-world parasites have relatively small mouths, certainly larger than I'm comfortable with, but a Metroid by comparison would have a mouth with a width of a foot or two, and these powerful teeth would dig deep. Even though the Metroid won't get much of a chance to eat you, I think there's a significant risk of lasting tissue damage because of its size and power, and you would probably bleed out if you didn't receive prompt medical care. Number 33. Mother Brain. I talked quite in depth about lasers in the final Smash video, so I don't want to rehash too much here. The quick version is that laser weapons do exist, but usually involve lasers triggering some remote explosive, and the actual laser portion really has no visual component, at least not to the human eye. As light obviously travels at light speed, it's much too fast to actually perceive in motion. The extremely focused beam of light used in laser weapons therefore would be imperceptible. Mother Brain uses the Laser Brain attack, straight from Super Metroid. For this light to be perceivable, like say the lasers used at a concert, the light must be interacting with dust and other interfering particles in the air, making it scatter and grow progressively less concentrated. There's also no explosive materials being remotely set off via this laser, so this move would be about as harmful as a silent disco. This isn't the only part of the attack though. You may also get hit by one of the flying rinkas. These are a little harder to pin down because the Metroid series has been a little inconsistent on what these actually are, sometimes described as living organisms, sometimes as an energy projectile, and yet other times as fire-based projectiles. Energy projectiles are always a little vague in fiction, but if we consider them as fire, you could obviously be subjected to burns, and if we look at them as plasma, things would be even more severe. Plasma is essentially a superheated gas, so hot that electrons are stripped away, so getting pelted with a blob of plasma would cause extremely severe and likely unsurvivable burns. even if you dodged the rinkas. Another concern is around halfway through her attack when the glass casing around the brain shatters. Broken glass, especially moving at speed, can be extremely dangerous. Depending on what shards hit you where at what speed, you might sustain anything from minor cuts to severe life-threatening lacerations of major arteries. With a truly severe injury, you can bleed out in under 3 minutes, long before any help will typically be able to arrive. I hope you enjoyed the disco, because Mother Brain has given you a lot of other injuries to worry about. Number 32. Roden. Roden brings a couple of moves, including a stomp and his version of the afterburner kick. While it would certainly hurt to have a beefy dude fall on top of you or slide kick you, these moves hardly matter compared to his main attack, which is his spin on Bayonetta's wicked weaves. Although obviously fists don't get that large or go through portals, we can estimate how something fist-like might impact you. A very rough estimate puts this punching arm around 15 feet in length, around 10 times longer than a real-life arm. I took the average weight of a human fist and forearm and scaled things up in keeping with the square cube law and got a very rough estimate of 2,600 pounds. This is possibly too low an estimate, but even so would be potentially fatal. Given the speed of the punch and the weight, it would be at least as much force as a car crash at 30 miles per hour. While numbers vary wildly on this, 30 to 40% of impacts at this force might be fatal. Number 31. Midna. Though Midna's hair has magical properties in Twilight Princess, there's a convenient real-world counterpart: non-magical hair. In her assist trophy attack, her hair transforms into a hand and throws the opponent. There's no reason you couldn't design a slingshot of sorts made from hair, if you had enough time and a weirdly open access to unused hair. You could maybe even knot things together in a way to kind of make it look like a hand. What I'm imagining here is a sort of trebuchet made of hair with a woven hand-shaped cocoon for tossing that would be flung out via a rope made of yet more hair. With enough hair and some proper weaving technique, this would actually be more than strong enough to carry and toss you. Hair is surprisingly strong. Its tensile strength, a measurement of how far something can stretch before it breaks, usually represented in megapascal, is in the neighborhood of 200 megapascal. This is about half as strong as steel, and much stronger than many woods used in construction. Certainly strong enough to create a webbing that could carry you in an arc around Midna. While the hand does snap around a bit, basically what we're looking at here is a simple centrifugal force calculation, which will tell you the force you are being thrown in this arc. Counting frames, we can measure the angular velocity by extrapolating how many rotations per minute you are moving at maximum speed, and we can guess the length of this hairy hand compared to character size. If we gloss over some of the nitty-gritties of the calculation, this gives us an average weight person getting thrown with a force of 22,000 newtons. That sounds like a lot, and in some ways definitely is. It's enough to break any bone in the body by a long shot, but people do survive worse. This actually ties into the previous ranking because this force is also roughly equivalent to what you might experience crashing your car at 30 miles per hour. So depending on a ton of factors, direction and angle of exit, body positioning, height and distance before impacting the ground, this move could land you anywhere from relatively injured to very dead. Number 30. Springman. Springman does pretty much as advertised, attacking with spring-loaded fists. In ARMS, his home series, he is clearly a capable fighter, seen in the Grand Prix ending with championship belts. But how dangerous could even the most capable of fighters be armed with only spring-loaded boxing gloves? A compressed spring can certainly pack a punch when unleashed. There are even spring-piston guns, which can fire a bullet up to half as fast as a traditional gunpowder setup. I wanted to do a rough estimate of how much force Springman's punch might pack. There was a lot of guessing thrown in, but given its approximate length in-game and using the comparative spring force constant of a shock absorber, we can use Hooke's law to calculate this punch to clock almost 27,000 newtons of force. It's certainly enough to break any bone in your body and likely cause irreparable damage and probable demise. Number 29. Skull Kid. This one is tough to rank, as many of Skull Kid's effects are only really applicable in the in-game world of Smash. Skull Kid has the power to randomly deploy one of 3 effects: flip the camera, reverse directional inputs, and turn players invisible. Invisibility is the most easily quantifiable, so let's start there. Invisibility in itself doesn't actually exist, but cutting-edge engineering has developed workarounds like metamaterials that can bend light around objects, creating a similar effect to invisibility. This of course wouldn't cause damage to you at all. As for flipping the camera, this one is really tough to translate to real life. Gravity isn't flipped or anything like that, it is purely a visual trick. I think the only apt way to translate this is to treat your vision as the in-game camera, in which case, there are actually conditions that could cause a similar phenomenon. Reversal of vision metamorphopsia, RVM, is a rare condition, most commonly caused by a stroke, that makes a person experience a perceived upside-down 180-degree rotation of the visual field. This is pretty much exactly what you experience in-game when Skull Kid uses his power. It's not something really worth worrying about in the real world though. When I say rare, I mean rare. Only 52 cases of RVM have been reported in the past 50 years. Despite its rarity though, it has most commonly signaled a basilar artery stroke, an acutely deadly affliction with a mortality rate hovering around 85%. So the implications of experiencing this visual effect could be that Skull Kid has bestowed on you a largely life-threatening form of stroke. The reversal of inputs is another one similarly challenging to put in real-world context. There are diseases that can cause some similar effects, although none that exactly leads to a flipping of limb motion. Limb kinetic apraxia causes motor difficulties, rendering the afflicted unable to perform motor tasks the way they are intending. Apraxia onsetting later in life is most commonly a result of brain damage, which of course can be a life-threatening concern. If you survive the brain damage initially, it's pretty hit or miss how apraxia will evolve over the remainder of your life. Some people do get better with therapy, others see no progress, or even degeneration. Another interesting semi-relevant condition is congenital mirror movement disorder, where one side of the body will obviously and unintentionally mirror movements on the other side. This one seems perhaps less applicable though, as it's caused by genetic mutations and is present from infancy or early childhood. Regardless, as Skull Kid's moveset overall leaves you with a 2/3 chance of brain damage, which itself could be fatal, I think this is a fair place to rank him. Number 28. Ashley. When Ashley is summoned, she conjures a cloud that affects all players caught within it, primarily by slowing and causing steady damage, although many other random effects can occur as well. These include invisibility, causing food to damage instead of heal, shrinking players, making players helpless, and so on. I don't believe it's specified anywhere what the cloud is supposed to be, and there's not a lot of options. The only gas that appears purple is iodine vapor, which doesn't become gas until extremely high temperatures, 363 degrees Fahrenheit. Truthfully, this is a stretch as well, because iodine is highly reactive and will quickly combine with other elements to form non-gaseous compounds, essentially meaning the purple vapor would be short-lived. But it's the closest real-world comparison I could think of. If it helps my case, iodine gets its name from the Greek word meaning purple. Now, obviously iodine gas wouldn't cause you to shrink or go invisible, but it definitely wouldn't be comfortable. Given the heat of the gas, it would cause severe burns as well as damage to eyes and respiration. If you don't buy the gas's iodine vapor hypothesis, there are, after all, ways to color water vapor. Even shining a colored light through it will do the trick. We can also do a rundown of the deadliness of the gas cloud's in-game effects. If food started causing damage, like say every meal leading to food poisoning, you'd be in trouble after just a couple days. The risk likely wouldn't be starvation, but severe dehydration, a dangerous side effect of food poisoning. With the body continuing to reject food, it may also be hard to keep liquids down. Dehydration can lead to death in as little as 3 days, although if we're going strictly off the in-game timer, you would be fine as the effects naturally don't last that long. Invisibility, as we've already discussed with Skull Kid, wouldn't be harmful. Incapacitation would depend on what substance is used, for example, chloroform or sleeping gas, and while most effects are temporary, long-term side effects could include organ damage or, in the case of overexposure, you might see more immediate and deadly results such as coma or indeed death. Probably the most clearly deadly effect would be shrinking you. Even though a shrink ray obviously doesn't exist, we can somewhat guess at what scientific processes you would undergo if subjected to one. As I found out from the last video, everyone hates the square cube law, but I'm obligated to bring it back up here as it works in reverse too. Shrinking someone by half in linear dimensions would decrease their mass by 8 times. This means muscle mass would significantly decrease, and muscles may no longer be strong enough to let you stand up or even breathe properly. It's also hard to guess at the havoc this would wreak on internal systems. Our body is designed to process things at exactly our scale, so if everything was halved proportionally, we may no longer be able to process nutrients or remove waste efficiently. Also, significantly narrowed blood vessels would make it more challenging for the heart to pump viscous blood through the body, leading to severe circulation issues. Although it's hard to know what would get you, you would definitely die anywhere in the range of instantly to quickly. This leaves Ashley with a pretty wide range of potential effects, anywhere from completely harmless to instant bizarre death, so I'm gonna average it out and put her here. Number 27. Isaac. Returning for the first time since Brawl, Isaac adds 2 moves, bringing his attack roster to 3. Similar, although slightly different from their functioning Golden Sun, these moves essentially create gigantic hands that can either push players off screen, lift players off screen, or smash down onto players. Canonically, these giant hands aren't literally giant hands, but rather a type of energy field. So, I think it's time to discuss a real-world energy field that could theoretically push you around like this. Magnets. While many people have claimed to be magnetic, there's no evidence to back this up. Sadly, if you think you're magnetic, you're probably just sticky. Tests of self-proclaimed human magnets have routinely showed no measurable magnetic field, and probably the most damning evidence of mere stickiness is that non-magnetic objects have also stuck to supposedly magnetic people, and talc applied to the skin has made them lose their magnetism. So if objects are sticking to you, you didn't get a sketchy vaccination, you probably just need a bath. That said, even if you aren't magnetic, you are diamagnetic. Essentially, a magnetic field can change the course of electrons, leading them to create an opposing magnetic field. This field is usually negligibly weak, but it does cause a slight repulsion from the magnet. As all objects are made of atoms, this means that all objects are diamagnetic to some degree, and with a powerful enough magnet could be made to levitate. You can actually see this effect in action because scientists are always doing excellent random BS, and one group of researchers used a 16 Tesla magnet to levitate a live frog. The image of the flying frog was published in the April 1997 issue of Physics World, which led to many assuming it was a prank. This wacky scientific baloney earned Andre Geim, the lead researcher in frog levitation, an Ig Nobel Prize in 2000, an annual award given out to honor the most delightfully pointless advances in science. Lest you think Geim's career was wasted though, just 10 years later he won an actual Nobel Prize in physics, which currently makes him the only person ever to receive both awards. Tangents aside, if you can levitate a frog, you can levitate a person with the same principles, although the strength of the magnet you would need for this is ludicrous. In a calculation done on a physics blog, which I'm going to trust at face value because it is absurdly thorough and uses math way beyond my comprehension, it would take in the realm of an 88 Tesla magnet to levitate a person. This seems to be well beyond the strength of any magnet that currently exists. From what I can glean from the free sample of this article in Nature, the record is currently held by a 45.5 Tesla magnet, although my intel is limited because I didn't want to drop $200 on a subscription for this one musing. The research on what strong magnets could do to your body is seemingly inconclusive and pretty confusing. The health and safety recommendations of Georgia Tech's research department caps routine exposure at no more than 2 Tesla. However, specially trained workers can safely work under a value of 8 Tesla. This is somewhat undercut though when later in the safety brief it says exposure to the limbs of workers shouldn't exceed 20 Tesla, and it's altogether unclear what would happen if you did go over this limit. Eventually, if subject to enough magnetic force, it would strip the electrons from your molecules, literally atomizing you. This could actually happen elsewhere in the universe. Magnetars, neutron stars with especially strong magnetic fields, could atomize you from thousands of miles away, turning you into a cloud of plasma that would accelerate to near light speed. But this is many orders of magnitude stronger than our levitation magnet here. Possibly, you could survive being magnetically pushed. It seems less plausible, but maybe still possible, that you could survive being magnetically crushed under the same force. What you probably wouldn't survive, though, is being levitated. It seems an 88 Tesla magnet might get you off the ground, but to go high enough to reach comparable in-game heights, it's hard to even guess how strong a magnet would have to be and what it would do to you. Even if you survive the lift, though, there's nothing to cushion your fall back down. The LD50 of falling is about 4 stories, just shy of 50 feet. LD50 describes the dose of something at which 50% of a population will die, and is usually used in context with chemicals, but here basically means you have a 50% chance of surviving the fall from this move. Although hard to guess exactly as you are taken off screen, relative to character height you are being lifted at least 50 feet, possibly higher, giving you less than ideal odds of walking this one off. Number 26. Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight will essentially swap back and forth between 2 primary shovel-based attacks. The first sees the shovel being used properly to scoop up dirt and toss it at people, just like you're supposed to do. I think this move more closely falls in the ballpark of irritating rather than actually dangerous. The worst outcome would be if any of the soil got tossed into your eyes, which could lead to a potential corneal abrasion or infection. Likely though, the worst outcome would be a dirt stain on your outfit. You wouldn't have much time to be mad though, because Shovel Knight's second attack raises more serious concerns. I found some discrepancies in a cannon height for Shovel Knight, but several sources put him around 5'5". The average weight for a 5'5" male, with the added 30 to 50 pounds of armor that a full medieval-style outfitting would add, put our knight between 150 to 200 pounds. That's a lot of weight to be coming directly down on you, focused on the point of a shovel. Although shovels are obviously designed for yard work instead of murder, I've seen more than enough zombie movies to be convinced of its status as a viable weapon. This kind of impact coming literally head-on would deliver deadly, or at least severely debilitating, blunt force trauma. Number 25. Starman. Starman drops by from the Earthbound series to complicate things with a move that has no direct real-world translation. The attack Starman uses is a coin toss between two variants of PK Beam. In Earthbound, this is a PSI attack, which sadly doesn't translate to our world as there is no verifiable evidence of extrasensory or psychic abilities, certainly not of anyone being able to conjure a beam attack. Taking it from that perspective, Starman would do little more than give themselves a headache from concentrating on you really hard. But that seems a bit unfair to this move, so let's ignore the semantics and focus more on its in-game appearance. When you're at a distance, you can clearly see Starman is firing off a lightning bolt. I don't want to retread too much ground from the Smash Finals video, as we spent a good amount of time on electricity and lightning, but the quick version is that lightning strikes are surprisingly not as fatal as you might expect. Despite the brutality of the event, only about 10% of cases end in death, although the remaining 90% can be left with a variety of disabilities and an all-round bad day. Given that Starman uses the attack multiple times though, I think you'd be pretty much fried. Unless you're Roy Sullivan, who holds the record for getting struck by lightning, having been unlucky enough to be struck 7 times, although simultaneously lucky enough to survive each strike. It would have been 8 times, except he narrowly escaped one of them when it instead struck his wife. Number 24. Phosphora. Phosphora continues her legacy from the Kid Icarus franchise by using a series of electricity-based attacks. There are 3 options: a single blue ball, 3 yellow balls, or 3 bolts. I talked in depth about this in the Final Smash video, but ball lightning is a likely real, albeit understudied phenomena. So, all these attacks are theoretically plausible on some level. I'm giving these lightning strikes an advantage over Starman though, as they are more targeted, so you're even more likely to be hit multiple times and fried. Number 23. Lyn. We talked quite a bit about swords in the Final Smash rankings. Such a large portion of Smash fighters are sword wielders, and we get some of that with assist trophies as well. Lyn drops in from Fire Emblem, naturally making her a sword wielder. What sets her apart though is her incredibly fast launch, which relative to character sizes has her traveling around 100 miles per hour. This is of course faster than anyone could actually charge you, but with some sort of mechanical launch behind it, this could make for a pretty powerful slash. In scientific papers that actually exist news, someone calculated the peak speed of a sword's cutting edge at just shy of 50 miles per hour for a standard slice from a professional swordsman. So, given this, a well-timed slice from Lyn might hit with nearly triple its usual force. A properly sharpened blade is already strong enough to slice bone as is. So, assuming the excess speed doesn't throw Lyn's timing, this move could possibly have enough power to cleave you in half and would certainly leave you a goner. The only reason I'm placing it at the bottom of the swords pack is that she slashes just once. With improper timing or balance, you could make it out of this one on luck alone. Number 22. Claptrap. Taking a brief interlude from swords, we have another pretty gnarly attack here. Although leaping in from the fictional world of Donkey Kong, the Claptrap is pretty clearly inspired by a crocodile, and this is not an animal whose bite you'd want to end up on the wrong side of. In fact, it's probably the bite you'd least want to end up on the wrong side of in the animal kingdom, as the saltwater crocodile holds the record for the strongest bite force of any animal. At least any recorded animal, computer simulations have shown the great white shark may slightly exceed it. This crocodile species clocked 3,700 pounds per square inch, PSI. For comparison, you'd only need 150 PSI to tear into a steak, and even other formidable predators like lions and tigers are only able to generate around 1,000 PSI bite force. The bite of a saltwater crocodile is strong enough to break steel and could bite through your puny human bones like a lightly whipped butter. Now, this type of crocodile is huge, with males ranging from 10 to 20 feet, but even a scaled-down croc more in line with a claptrap, like the roughly 5-foot West African dwarf crocodile, would be deadly. This smaller and almost kinda cute Pixar-style croc is almost as strong as its lengthier cousin, clocking a bite force still in the 3,500 psi range, which could easily chew through you. Even though they are a formidable predator, generally crocodiles won't target humans, but it certainly isn't unheard of. Around 1,000 deaths per year can be attributed to saltwater crocodiles alone. If you were targeted, you also don't have a lot of good options. For such odd, lumpy dinosaurs, they can move quickly, hurtling up to 18 miles per hour towards a catch. This leads to between 50 to 60% of attacks being fatal, and with the kind of grip that Claptrap gets on you here, you seem pretty likely to end up in the less fortunate half. Number 21. Sheriff. Obviously, you aren't likely to encounter a pixelated character from a 70s arcade game. Interestingly, a game Shigeru Miyamoto worked on before his breakout creation of Donkey Kong in the early 80s. But let's upscale the resolution of this guy and look at what it might be like to encounter a real Wild West deputy. They might be carrying something in the ballpark of a Colt single-action army, a popular revolver among lawmen introduced in 1873. This gun was serious business. A popular cartridge for it was the .45 Colt, nicknamed the Horse Killer. Gunshot wounds are survivable. One study found the overall rate of survival to be around 64%, but this naturally depends on so many factors, from location of wound to promptness of medical attention to pre-existing health of the victim. Especially given that Sheriff fires repeatedly and is likely to hit you with multiple shots, I think your chances of walking this one off aren't great. Number 20. Girahim. Back to swords. Making use of many of the same attacks as in Skyward Sword, his origin game, Girahim is primarily a sword wielder. Sword attacks are of course very dangerous and potentially lethal, and given the repeat slashing here, you almost certainly wouldn't make it out of this one. I want to focus though on why I've placed Girahim near the bottom of the sword assists. Girahim doesn't just use sword slashes, he also has a couple of other maneuvers as well which lessen his overall lethality. Part of his time is spent teleporting around the stage, but we'll disregard this ability as his complex bending of the laws of physics doesn't actually damage you in-game. His other significant non-sword move is his ability to throw knives. As far as distance weapons go, throwing knives seem to be relatively ineffective when stacked against most competition. While there certainly are master knife throwers out there, the extreme precision needed to hit a target in any deadly area, especially a target in motion, makes them an unreliable attack. Knife throws are also slow compared to other long-distance attacks, clocking only around 30 miles per hour, which may give enough time for you to throw up arms or dodge in self-defense, meaning even a knife throw that would have landed its mark might miss. For the sake of comparison, a recurve bow can fire arrows around 150 miles per hour, and a compound bow can hit the 200 miles per hour mark. An effective javelin throw may travel around 70 miles per hour, doubling the speed of the knife. You could even probably throw a rock in the ballpark of 90 miles per hour. All of these many strikes against the throwing knife are only compounded by the kicker that if Girahim didn't get a one-hit KO on you, they have quite literally gifted you with a weapon to fight back. While their sword attacks could certainly be lethal on their own merit, the time wasted on an attack much less likely to inflict debilitating damage puts Girahim near the bottom of the sword pack. Number 19. Takamaru. Takamaru also wields a sword, although they're in the same camp as they also have a long-range blade throw option. For the long-range assault, he throws windmill swords, which as far as I can gather are not a real thing. They seem similar enough to the aforementioned knife throws that I feel like they can comfortably be grouped around the same level. It could be argued they are even worse, as these blades are thrown with a spin, meaning Takamaru would also have to correctly assess rotation to hit their mark, significantly narrowing the window of throws that would land an effective blow. They'd still most likely kill you though, as they strike many times with a katana in the other half of their move. Although sources will vary on preference and the wielder will naturally have a major impact, there seems to be a relatively broad consensus that katanas are some of history's deadliest swords. The design and process of forging a katana leads to one of the sharpest types of bladed weapon, capable of clear and deadly cuts. The fact that Takamaru slashes many more times than Girahim gives them the edge in my opinion. Number 18. Alucard. Alucard, the half-human son of Dracula from multiple Castlevania games, makes use of a couple attacks carried over from the Castlevania series. The first is slashing with Crisagrim. Each attack appears to strike with 6 swipes, although it's slightly difficult to keep track because only the sword swipes are visible, not the movement of the sword itself, which tracks with the animation from its source games. Although canonically the sword's power comes from the wind, I have no idea what to do with this information scientifically, so let's take the sword at face value and dive a little deeper on this sword's deadliness as a whole. From its renders across the Castlevania series, the sword appears to be extremely wide in the blade and relatively compact in length, similar to the Gladius. This type of sword was popular with foot soldiers in ancient Rome and was largely used for stabbing in the abdominal area, which was almost always deadly. As used by Alucard, the sword is wielded more as a slashing tool, but even with this unconventional technique, you would likely be dismembered and most probably dead. It's good that Alucard remembered to bring his sword though, because his other moves would be comparatively flimsy. Alucard will also occasionally use his Mist transformation, a long-time ability in Dracula lore. Although there is obviously no real-world way to transform to Mist or vice versa, even if Alucard could come at you in cloud format, you wouldn't have much to worry about. Although there are versions of Mist in Castlevania that are poisonous gas clouds, this transformation appears to just be standard Mist. At a technical level, Mist is just water vapor, so the worst case scenario here is getting uncomfortably damp. Alucard's other transformation turns him into bat form, although it's difficult to tell exactly what type of bat he is, and I don't believe it's ever specified in the canon. Alucard is supposed to be just shy of 6 feet, and his bat form isn't much smaller. This makes the giant golden-crowned flying fox a good real-world equivalent. It's the world's largest bat, with a wingspan averaging over 5 feet, and is truly haunting to see next to a person. Despite its alarming size and spooky appearance, these bats are known to be quite peaceful. They're vegetarian and generally considered harmless, although having one fly into you would certainly be startling. All of this hardly matters though, as you'd be long dead and dismembered by Blade. As he wastes less time on his other, less effective moves than previous sword fighters, I'm still giving him the edge here. Number 17. Gray Fox. Gray Fox is another sword fighter who has a couple major advantages. Obviously, he's a very talented swordsman, and also he's extremely quick. Additionally, he reflects projectiles back. This is reminiscent of his ability in Metal Gear to slice through a bullet in motion, which at first I assumed would be downright impossible until I saw a video of Master Swordsman Isao Machi doing literally just that. It should be noted that this bullet was a BB pellet which moves at the slower end of bullet speeds, but that's still considerably faster than I would have believed anyone could react, especially with such astonishing precision. All to say, if Gray Fox is slicing projectiles, they would clearly be a powerful foe, leaving you with little opportunity to fight back. I think the major drawback of Gray Fox's attack style is their use of the stylistic but much less effective reverse grip. While there are a couple advantages to fighting with the sword backwards, including stealth and surprise, there's a reason you don't see this fighting style much outside of trying to look cool. Gray Fox would be subjecting themselves to a variety of handicaps and inconveniences, most notably decreasing range, throwing off balance, and decreasing power by up to 70%. This awkward grip would also possibly make it easier to disarm and would definitely lead to quicker fatigue, as it places the sword's weight on an odd and unnatural part of the wrist. This said, I'm pretty confident Gray Fox would still kill you. Their exquisite training and insane speed would make quick work of you and leave little opportunity to fight back. I'm only ranking them below other sword fighters because their weird choice of grip may make these wounds slightly less deep, giving you a slight chance of leaving only severely disfigured instead of completely dead. Number 16. Samurai Goro. Another dangerous sword fighter, Goro chases you down and slashes repeatedly with a katana. Judging by his self-proclaimed samurai status, I'm assuming he knows how to use the sword, and even regardless of his technique, this would be deadly. Given the relentless slashing from Goro, I think this is almost certainly going to kill you. Number 15. Black Knight. I'm giving Black Knight the top spot in our sword fighting assists. There's definitely fair arguments that can be made to rearrange this section, as all the sword assists are strong fighters armed with deadly weapons, but I give the top of the sword pack to Black Knight. Not only do they pack a powerful attack, but he's the most heavily protected out of any sword fighter. Clad in hefty full body armor, you have virtually no shot at a defensive strike to try and briefly extend your time left alive. Number 14. Tiki. Tiki appears and then quickly uses her dragon stone to turn into her dragon form. Let's set aside the mechanics of human-animal transformation and focus on Tiki as a fire-breathing creature. Although there are no fire-breathing animals that we know of, the ability seems theoretically possible. For example, the bombardier beetle stores chemicals in its abdomen that it can eject when threatened, chemicals that will mix mid-air and undergo a heat-releasing chemical reaction, basically spraying a threat with boiling fluid. If a creature had the ability to store chemicals that caused a flammable reaction, it could similarly release them at will. Given that, I think you'd be looking at effects similar to getting sprayed with a flamethrower, namely agonizing third-degree burns, possible respiratory failure from inhaling burning fumes, and likely death. Certainly if prompt medical attention is unavailable. It's tough to rank at this point as you're virtually certain to die from many of these, but I think a full body burning would be more drawn out than death via sword slashing, so I'll give it the edge here for its slow brutality. Number 13. Wily Capsule. Dr. Wily combines a lot of dangerous elements we've seen in previous attacks, here sending out orbs with one of three properties: fire, electricity, or ice. The combining of the deadly disparate elements into one makes this attack even more deadly than the sum of its parts. Wily can also ram you with the drill-like point of his ship, which would clearly be powerful enough to impale you if you hadn't already succumbed to one of his elemental attacks. Number 12. Zero. Although an assist trophy, Zero comes with a relatively robust set of moves, all revolving around his weapon, the Z-Saber. Described as an energy blade, it bears much resemblance to a lightsaber. Of course, lightsabers don't, and as far as we know, can't really exist. But a company called Hacksmith Industries did a really clever real-world lightsaber using compressed liquid propane gas, fueled by oxygen, creating a beam sword very similar to the Z-Saber. This beam runs at a scorching 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cut through basically anything, especially you. Whether Zero is spinning, slashing, or uppercutting, this beam would deliver a devastating concentrated blaze. It's possible that it wouldn't completely cut through you as the slashes are fast, and we can see it takes a moment to completely melt through a material, but with repeat attacks I find it unlikely you could survive this onslaught. One attack, the Genmu Zero, is a long-range version, which I think could operate under similar principles, and the Ryunjin, an uppercut, also includes a flaming element. The increased range and addition of extra flame or a small explosive only make this an even more surefire execution. Number 11. Rathalos. Partially because they appear as both a boss and an assist trophy, Rathalos has a relatively full roster of attacks they can deploy, and it would be fairly unpleasant to be on the receiving end of any of them. Rathalos is a wyvern, a type of dragon, and clocks in around 55 feet in length. This is a bit over a third larger than the real-life T-Rex, but that still seems like a relatively fair lens to look at this creature through. At first, I'd wondered if Rathalos' size would handicap the creature as it seemed too large and bulky to ever take flight, but I found a great article on Medium offering some scientific backing on how dragon flight might be possible. It's a very in-depth piece and fairly technical, but makes a lot of interesting points that convince me Rathalos would be able to fly around. Although Assist Trophy Rathalos doesn't fly into the background like Boss Rathalos, they still make use of flight for several moves, such as Rush Attack. Swooping towards you and attacking with their talons, you would be subject to a pretty brutal move. The largest talons in the actual animal kingdom are the Harpy Eagles, which can go up to about 5 inches. Rathalos is over 15 times larger than a Harpy Eagle, so there's little doubt its claws would be strong, long, and sharp enough to slice through you. This is before even considering the possible poison effects of the claws. Claw attacks can deal poison damage when Rathalos is a boss, although not when they're an assist trophy, so I won't consider it a factor here, but it hardly matters as you'd be dead poison or not. You wouldn't fare much better even if Rathalos was facing the other way. Another move in their arsenal is Tailspin, where you'd get clubbed by their hefty spiked tail. This reminds me of the Ankylosaurus, which has been hypothesized through analysis of CT scans to have been strong enough to crush bones with a good swing. Never mind that Rathalos would have been over 1.5 times the size of even the largest Ankylosaurus. Worst of all would be any of its head-on attacks. Even the roar attack would hurt in real life. Estimates put a T-Rex roar around 140 decibels, similar to a jet engine at close range, which is loud enough to cause hearing damage. Then of course, there's the teeth. The gliding attack is a mouth-first slide tackle. A T-Rex bite is estimated to have been the strongest bite force to ever grace the animal kingdom, applying over 7 tons of force, and its rigid skull would have allowed it to crush a car. Seeing as Rathalos would only be even stronger than this, you'd be chomped through like a stick of melty butter. Oh yeah, and Rathalos can also spit fire. Whichever way Rathalos came at you, you wouldn't walk away from this grumpy dragon. Number 10. Bomberman. Bomberman's attack pretty obviously has them drop a series of bombs, as per their namesake. But what type? Explosives come in many shapes and sizes, but are the familiar cartoon bombs left by Bomberman based off any real weapons? Well, yes, actually. Before developments in the mid-19th century, the only way to detonate a bomb was via a slow burn fuse, hopefully timed correctly to get the enemy and not the person lighting the fuse. There's actually a reason the classic bomb shape looks so much like a cannonball. They were often fired from cannons, and a skilled bombardier would cut the fuse appropriately to time the explosion with the bomb's arrival. Although it's worth noting that the fuses were generally made out of wood and the string wick is largely fictional. The fact that we still associate this antiquated image with the bomb is an example of a skeuomorph, when a design intentionally mirrors how an object looked in a previous era, such as the phone app on our smartphones resembling a classic landline. So, how deadly would one of these classic explosives be? Even without the added power of being launched via cannon, these weapons were popular for so long precisely because they were so effective. Often made of cast iron or other sturdy materials to maximize shrapnel, standing anywhere in the immediate vicinity of any of Bomberman's drop-offs would spell death, with at least certain catastrophic mutilation. Number 9. Nikki. While Nikki scribbling all over the place in itself is pretty hard to make risky, ink is minimally toxic, but it would take a lot of scribbles to be subject to any real danger, I want to focus on what Nikki is scribbling. As these drawings have the ability to interact with players and cause damage, I think it's only fair to consider each drawing as its own legitimate hazard. There are 6 possible drawings that may be done in any combination. Let's take a look at each in increasing order of deadliness. I want to start by disregarding the smash ball. Obviously, I've already talked plenty about final smashes, and there's no in-universe explanation of what exactly a smash ball itself might be. It was described on Smash 4's website only as a mysterious sphere. If you really want to include it, I suppose it might be similar to having a bowling ball thrown at you, which is quickly becoming my favorite frame of reference for weight. It's obviously a hard enough substance that it takes several good hits to break apart, so this alone could cause broken bones or significant bodily trauma. But even disqualifying the smash ball, the other drawings still have some tricks up their sleeve. Least deadly is the ghost. There's no hard science showing evidence of ghosts, so there's no hard science showing this could hurt you in any way. Next, I'd put the pinwheel. Now this isn't to say blades can't spin fast. The blades of a commercial jet compressor rotate around 1,000 miles per hour, easily powerful enough to turn you into pudding, as any Indiana Jones fans will be very familiar with. A pinwheel isn't a turbine though, and will only spin as fast as the wind blows around it. Even though this pinwheel is huge, it's not spinning especially fast, and would have no impact on you beyond providing a nice breeze. Next up is the flock of birds. In-game, these birds are enormous, around as big as the player. Even though these birds look more like a dove of some sort, which in real life are only about a foot tall, they don't not look like a real-world bird of comparable size, the wandering albatross. It's the largest flighted bird species and is truly gargantuan. This picture speaks for itself. Although albatross are generally not considered dangerous to humans, an albatross attack could definitely hurt. They have a sharp beak that could cause some painful pecks. Now, to be fair, that's not exactly what Nikki draws, but still, I wouldn't want to be on the bad side of a bird the size of a person. Even worse, though, would be encountering the monster, which seems to be around the size of a T-Rex and can breathe fire, which is obviously all very bad news. Most dangerous of all, though, is probably the bullet bill. Bullets can get surprisingly large. The largest is the .950 JDJ, although this is now discontinued due to some obvious impracticalities. The in-game bullet bill is much larger though, so perhaps a more apt comparison would be a missile, especially as the bullet bill appears to be self-propelled. Probably the closest real-world example dimension-wise would be something like the AIM-54 Phoenix. Lengthwise, it's about right, although missiles have a much more streamlined aerodynamic shape, so it's not nearly as chunky as a bullet bill. I hate to say it, but you know what has the exact right dimensions? Almost one for one in the real world? I can already feel myself getting told off in the comments, though, for taking the leap that bullet bills are a nuke. So I'm gonna split the difference and say we have some sort of missile here, and therefore Nikki's art could certainly finish you off. The only potential saving grace is if you luck out and she only draws her wimpier portraits. Number 8. Thwomp. Thwomps don't have a consistent canonical size or even a consistent canonical appearance, changing pretty drastically over time. But here the Thwomp looks pretty similar to how it does in most recent games. All that to say, I think it's only fair to default to its size in Smash to figure out the power here. Relative to other characters in-game, Thwomp is around 10 feet tall, and as it's a cube, we can pretty easily estimate how much this would weigh. It's pretty clear Thwomp is a rock-based life form, and using a commercially available stone for easy calculation, let's assume Thwomp is made of gray granite. Given this, Thwomp would weigh in the ballpark of 165,000 pounds. That's only slightly less than this truck. This would clearly crush you beyond recognition regardless of what height it dropped from, before even factoring in that a Thwomp's outer edges are spiked. Number 7. Chain Chomp. It's also tough to pin down a consistent size for the Chain Chomp, as it varies quite a bit from game to game. Some games have the Chain Chomp similar in size to Mario, but others have truly gargantuan chomps. So as there isn't a consistent size across the game library, let's again take the in-game size for Smash. The Chomp is about the same size as the average human character in-game, which puts it around 6 feet. Even though the character is inspired by an angry dog, it actually comes from a frightening experience Mario creator Shigeru Miyamoto had as a kid, where a barking dog came at him and was held back just in time by its leash. The actual character design would lead to damage quite a bit more serious than a dog bite. That's not to say that dog bites can't be extremely harmful. Larger dogs have jaws strong enough to break bones and can easily tear apart flesh and muscle, but according to the Wii U Chain Chomp trophy, at least for PAL regions, the enemy is an iron ball. So, if you're dealing with a 6-foot iron ball, you'd be in danger even before the Chain Chomp bared its teeth. You can see how much damage this wrecking ball can cause, and this one only weighs in at 4 tons. I say only because an iron sphere the size of our Chain Chomp would weigh just shy of 28 tons. Being hit by the ball alone would easily crush you to a surefire demise, but Chain Chomp isn't just an inanimate ball. It's hard to even guess at the power behind the bite without any real frame of reference, but it's clearly both powerful and fast. The razor-sharp teeth, perhaps operating on some sort of hydraulic snap, would almost certainly be powerful enough to tear through any resistance put up by the puny human body. This would be a guaranteed, messy, and painful death. Number 6. Dr. Kawashima. Considering this character is based off an actual person, it's surprisingly difficult to place what would actually be happening here. This assist trophy is pulled from the Dr. Kawashima of the Brain Age games, who in turn is based off the actual neuroscientist whose work inspired the titles. But the move itself is pretty abstract, featuring numbers flying across the screen and colliding, exploding if they add up to 10 or higher. The risks of doing light math are pretty minimal. I couldn't find any evidence that single-digit addition has led to injury, so let's focus on the explosion part. We talked quite a bit about explosives in the Final Smash video, so I won't rehash the specific mechanisms that cause injury from an explosion. Hopefully, without securing my spot on some watch list, I trawled through some government documents on the comparative blast sizes of various explosives, and I think an apt comparison here would be a blast of around 200 kilograms of TNT. This creates a blast radius around 50 feet, roughly the same size as the exploding numbers from Dr. Kawashima. An explosion this big would have lethal pressure waves stretching out to around 150 feet, meaning anywhere within this zone would be certain death. Keep moving and pray the numbers don't add up for this one. Number 5. Andross. Although there's quite a bit of confusing backstory involving spirits and assorted hocus pocus, Andross appears in Smash in his mechanical incarnation, which simplifies things greatly. According to R-Wingpedia, the Star Fox wiki, Andross is 100 space meters tall and 80 space meters wide. After spending an embarrassing amount of time deducing that a space meter is exactly the same as a regular meter, I found this places Andross around 330 feet by 260 feet. About as tall as a football field and a little wider. His appearance in Smash is based off his original appearance in Star Fox, where essentially he was a collection of polygons in the game, largely due to technical limitations on the SNES hardware. But let's take this appearance at face value and consider Andross here as a massive, jagged metal space head during this particular attack. For his move, he follows an attack from his original game where he spits out large tiles towards the player. As the character is a floating space machine, I'm going to assume he's armored with the same types of metal that are popular for their strength and structural integrity on spacecraft. Titanium alloy would be a fair assumption, used because of its balance of strength and durability without being excessively heavy. This is relative though, because in reference to the character's size, the tiles he shoots out are in the ballpark of 50 feet along either side. I'll save you the math on this, but this would be pretty dang heavy, about the weight of an unloaded cargo ship like this one, which is incidentally for sale on Alibaba for $200,000. I assume shipping is included, given, you know. As far as I can tell, with each exhale, Andros shoots out 13 of these tiles, but you don't really need to be hit by 13 cargo ships to be crushed to death. Just one would do the trick. Number 4. Dr. Wright. Dr. Wright, a little-known character first appearing in the SNES version of SimCity, here appears to raise cities in quick succession. In Smash, these towers aren't much taller than your character, but in his home series, these buildings are supposedly building-sized, and he raises them to full height here in around a third of a second. The central building is probably of biggest concern because of the sharp spire on top, so let's focus on this. I counted 34 stories, which would put this building at a real-world height around 350 feet. We can estimate the force of this impact with a simple force calculation. Force equals mass times acceleration. The mass of a skyscraper around this size is more difficult to estimate, but from what I can gather, 150,000 tons seems like a reasonable guess. The results of this dish out a staggering impact force, roughly equivalent to laying down with the entire Great Pyramid of Giza on top of you. It goes without saying that this kind of impact would shatter you beyond all repair, certainly not helped by the brunt of the force being taken via a pointy spire. Number 3. Chef Kawasaki. For anyone disappointed I didn't include old Final Smashes in the last video, here's the redemption round. Kirby's Final from Brawl is here repurposed as Chef Kawasaki, who takes players and cooks them in a big pot. Even though in-game he only turns on the burner for a few seconds, which would mean you basically would just get dunked in room temperature water, I don't think that's really in the spirit of the move to rank it from that angle. So, let's take the chef at their word and see what would happen if you were actually boiled in a pot of soup. Sadly, we know pretty much exactly how this would go because this method of execution has genuinely been used throughout history. Although not as popular as other methods of execution, during the rule of King Henry VIII, boiling alive was made the de facto form of capital punishment against those accused of murder by poisoning. There are other sporadic examples throughout history of death by boiling as well, and the process would be truly awful. To start with, water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, much hotter than you'd be able to endure. The human body can only comfortably deal with water up to around 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and even then, as little as 5 minutes of exposure could cause third-degree burns. By 130 degrees, it would take as little as 30 seconds. By the time water reaches boiling point, you would feel a blast of pain before even hitting the surface. A pot large enough for you to fall into would be expelling a significant amount of steam, which would scald painfully as soon as it touched your skin. This would likely cause you to involuntarily scream, or at least breathe heavily, meaning you would accidentally breathe in the burning steam and scald your lungs. As soon as you make contact with the water itself, your skin will immediately begin to cook. This would cause excruciating pain. Felt at first in your extremities, as they have the most nerve endings. Your body would begin to pump more blood to the skin's surface, causing you to swell and blister, while simultaneously the broth begins to cook your internal organs while you're still alive. Eventually, your nerve endings will be completely burned off, and around this time, your skin may have actually begun to melt and may stick to your clothes. Even if you were rescued at this point, this could mean that responders attempting to remove clothes may end up taking your skin off with them. By this point, you'd almost certainly be dead. But even if you were ejected from Kawasaki's pot still living, the damage to your body is irreversible and not survivable in the long term. Sadly, this gruesome fate has fallen to some people by accident through attempting to swim in natural hot springs. If you take anything away from this video, let it be to not do that. I'm ranking this one so far up the list because while we've been in the certain death zone for a while now and seen some attacks possibly more catastrophic overall, this is the slowest and most torturous demise we've seen, and earns a high spot for its truly gruesome nature. Number 2. Moon. I debated whether to stand in Earth's moon for this, but the resounding consensus from the last video was that y'all wanted canonical sizes, so let's do our best with that. As far as I can gather, there is no official listed size for the moon in Majora's Mask. There's an awful lot of magic and fantasy elements that could affect the interpretation, but I'm going to put them aside and turn to the most trusted source in fictional analysis, the game theorists. About a decade ago, they made a video about Link's quest in Majora's Mask, which conveniently includes a thorough analysis of the moon's size. If you want the full breakdown of how they arrived at the number, the video is well worth checking out, but it's a pretty foolproof conclusion that compared the size at Crash to Link's in-game height. This calculation gives us a moon diameter of just 208 feet, around 55,000 times smaller than Earth's moon. While our moon colliding with Earth would be an extinction-level event to life as we know it, even this much smaller body would still wreak havoc to a localized area. It is perhaps too small to talk about in conventional moon terms though, even though there isn't a minimum size for a body to be considered a moon as long as it has a stable orbit around a planet. The smallest known moon in our solar system is Deimos, one of Mars's moons, which is still on the magnitude of miles in diameter, roughly 7 miles. This assist trophy is more along the lines of some of the small bodies circling the edges of Saturn's rings, which are called moonlets, and include some comparable in size. With a real-world size comparison established, it's next important to figure out the composition of this specific moon. Obviously, different substances will have different impacts. A large ball of rice pudding would hit different than rock. There's no evidence the moon in Majora's Mask is made from rice pudding though, so I will substitute in the composition of a similarly sized asteroid, a mixture of rock, metal, and ice. We also need a sense of its velocity to finish the calculations. The same game theorist's video does a delightful job showing that in Majora's Mask, the incoming moon is moving absurdly slow. So slow that it would essentially cause no damage whatsoever. This calculation I will disregard though, as for our real-world analysis, it is impossible that any incoming object could move so slow, if only from the force of gravity alone. The actual impact speed may be a bit lower than a typical asteroid impact, as its speed would largely come from gravity as it falls from a decaying orbit, but for the sake of simplicity with calculation, let's treat the impact here as if it were incoming at the speed of a typical asteroid. We are now prepared to figure out what kind of damage this collision would do. Helpfully, researchers with Imperial College London and Purdue University created a wonderful tool where you can input all your data and then set an asteroid on your city of choice. I live in New York City and it's a fan favorite for destroying in fiction, so let's run the numbers for an impact right over the heart of Manhattan. In an area as densely populated as New York, we would certainly see some destruction. There wouldn't be an impact crater as the big hunk of rock would get torn apart on atmospheric entry, bursting into a cloud of fragments around 13,000 feet above the city, but we may see large fragments striking the surface. Basically every wooden structure across the 5 boroughs would collapse, with only Coney Island being far enough away to narrowly escape the worst impact. Although stronger structures like skyscrapers and bridges may survive without severe structural damage, every weaker structure in the greater New York area would be torn apart, and windows may be damaged as far afield as Trenton, New Jersey, and New Haven, Connecticut. This impact is comparable with a real-world asteroid observed in 1908. Exploding above eastern Siberia. The impact flattened trees across 830 square miles, with eyewitnesses describing a heat blast and pressure wave that threw people into the air. The impact to property and people was limited because of the remoteness of the area, but with an explosion directly above you as we see in-game, you are likely to be subject to severe injury or death. We can amp things up a bit if you're feeling unsatisfied. Even though the moon is described as rock-like in the Zelda wiki, there's no reason that it couldn't be largely metal. An incoming metal moon would be much denser and wouldn't break apart as easily on entry. In fact, an iron asteroid around the same size as the Majora's Mask moon created the famous meteor crater in Arizona. With the same parameters as before, but subbing in a metal moon, this would create an impact crater stretching for 30 blocks and collapse most every building in Manhattan. If the initial impact didn't kill you, getting crushed by a favorite landmark certainly would. As moons of rocky planets like Earth are usually made up of a combination of rock and metal, I think it's reasonable to expect an impact crater from this moon and an inescapable death surrounded by widespread destruction and mayhem. You might want to get out of town for a little while with the moon's impact on the horizon. Number 1. Shadow. This is a tricky one. Shadow uses Chaos Control, an ability allowing him to manipulate time. In Smash, he slows down opponents to the point of freezing time for them completely for a moment. In keeping with our current understanding of physics, this isn't really how the slowing of time would work. This isn't to say that time cannot be manipulated. Einstein's theory of relativity predicted the mind-boggling phenomenon of time dilation. This essentially showed that time is relative and can be influenced by frame of reference. For example, objects moving close to the speed of light appear to experience time much more slowly than objects moving at a lower speed. It also predicted that time would run slower in strong gravitational fields. This isn't just theoretical either. For example, there is a measurable difference between atomic clocks on Earth and those on the International Space Station, which is in a weaker gravitational field. These differences are minuscule at smaller levels. For example, an astronaut spending a year on the ISS would be 0.01 seconds younger than their twin on Earth. This means if you spent your entire life on the ISS and your twin spent it on Earth, after 100 years, you would have lived for a second less. Even though this is such a small fraction of time, it's crazy to think that this is actually real, not theoretical, but a real and measurable difference in time. Time dilation can have a much more dramatic effect at higher differentials, but sadly, there is no way to fit Shadow's complete pausing of time into our current understanding of physics. For time to stop completely for an object relative to an outside observer, that object would need to be moving at light speed. Sadly, physics just doesn't allow this. An object with mass would require infinite energy to accelerate to light speed, but you could theoretically get close. Let's say Shadow is able to accelerate you to 99% the speed of light. This would take a Herculean effort, well beyond anything we are able to achieve now. The fastest we've ever accelerated an object is the Parker Solar Probe, which reached speeds of 119,000 miles per second at the fastest on its approach to the sun. This sounds absurdly fast, and it is, but still clocks only 0.064% of light speed. The incredible advancements in science it would take for Shadow to boost you up to near light speed would ultimately be sort of underwhelming in this context. The relativity of time means it's only noticeable to the observer, so whilst someone watching would see time slow for you, your experience of time would be no different. This is a whole lot of fancy science to say that, essentially, Shadow isn't doing anything harmful to you. Or is he? Shadow's warping of time seems to make things go around half as fast for you. For time to move half speed relative to an observer, you would need to be moving around 90% the speed of light. Shadow seems to accelerate you to that point almost instantly. Going from 0 miles per hour to 90% the speed of light in a second would put around 28,380,000 Gs of force on you. The highest G-force ever survived was 214 Gs, experienced by driver Kenny Brock during a crash at a racing event. Most people wouldn't survive even around 20 Gs. In a well-earned, deadliest spot, Shadow would tear you apart completely, possibly down to a molecular level, and time dilation would be the least of your concerns. And there we go. Another ranking that nobody asked for is now complete. I do my best to be thorough, but I'm sure I missed some stuff. Corrections, fun facts, and funny jokes are always welcome in the comments. Beyond that, thanks for watching. We'll catch you next time.